Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe I have the most challenging presentation because, well, at least when I would be in the room, for me it would really be a challenge to stay awake. So I hope I will keep you awake after lunch. I will tell something about phosphorus surpluses, and manure management is of course related to it because it's our most important source of manure or phosphate. I have had help from some colleagues. Of course, this work is not done on my own. It's done together with a number of colleagues who all paid attention to several aspects of the phosphate problem. First, I will tell you something about the dairy situation in the Netherlands compared to Northern Ireland, then something about phosphate balance and the phosphate policy, and then how to mitigate these phosphorus surpluses at farm level, and then at the end also pay some attention to, okay, we have other environmental challenges as well. How do we deal with that? And is dairy able to deal with that? But first a comparison between Northern Ireland and the Netherlands. And then you see at this moment we have 4.2 million heads of cattle. 96% of this is dairy. We hardly have any beef cattle. Sheep, okay, we have less sheep than here in Northern Ireland, but when it comes to pigs, we have about the 25-fold compared to what you have here in Northern Ireland. Poultry, 5 times as much. Grassland, 25% more compared to Northern Ireland in the total area. But compared with that, okay, we also have 230,000 hectares of maize, which is all silage maize. We have arable land, 500,000 hectares, but our population is 9 times as high compared to Northern Ireland, and the total area is 4.2 million hectares. So it's a very high population density, and most of the regions are really urban regions, and there is some green in between. That's how you can consider it. If you look to the definition of the European Union regarding rural areas, we don't have rural areas in the Netherlands, because then you should be remote from all kinds of services and etc., etc. And that's not the case nowhere in the country. But having this large amount of animals means that we need to import, and also people, means that we need to import a lot of food and a lot of feed. Total imports in feed and food is 252 kilotons of phosphate. And for example, 80% of our feed grains are imported from the European Union. 80% of our feed protein is coming from abroad. Mainly soy, South America, North America partly, but also palm kernel expeller, etc., coming from Asia. We export 158 kilotons of phosphate, and it means that there is a surplus of 94 kilotons that stays in the Netherlands, which is 38% of the total imports. So it means that we have a huge surplus in the country. And where does it go? Well, 27 kilotons of phosphate has accumulated in agricultural soils. These are 2009 data. There are losses to water, 15 million kilos, so 15,000 kilotons, or 15 kilotons, which is mainly surface water. And there is also a loss to inert materials. And the loss to inert materials is mainly the human phosphorus cycle. So everything that you and I bring to room number 100 is going to wastewater treatments, and all the solid waste are incinerated. And this ends up in concrete and on the highways, which means that in fact it is taken out of the food cycle. So that's the most important loss. If you look to the accumulation on agricultural land, this is a process that's already going on for a very long time. It started already in the beginning of the 19th century, then with phosphate surpluses of 20-25 kg per hectare, going up to 40 in 1980, which was in fact the year that we had the highest stocking densities and highest use of phosphate, also synthetic fertilizer. And then we came to a surplus of 78 kilos of phosphate per hectare per year. So this is not only manure, this is manure and synthetic fertilizer. Then it decreased to 40 in 2008, and now it is in the range between 0 and 20 because we are going to equilibrium fertilization. In total, about 4,500 kilos of phosphate per hectare on every area, a hectare of agricultural land, which means that most of our area is high in phosphate. The problems with manure and high stocking densities has led to policy which already started in 1984. And it started with production rights, limited animal numbers and pigs and poultry. The only thing was that they didn't do it completely right at that moment, because they said on Friday they announced that on Monday there will be a ban on increasing animal numbers. So everything that's there is there, but it can't increase, which means that meant that in a number of municipalities the offices stayed open and many permits for building new barns were given. And this was all, well, before Monday, so it was included, which meant that we had an increase in the sector in one weekend that otherwise would happen in 3, 4, or 5 years. So from that on, they also found out that if we decide to do something on animal numbers, at the moment we tell it, it's active. And there will not be a weekend in between. Milk quota, which put limits to milk production, and then there became the first Fertilizer Act, which was also, in fact, limiting the manure production. Well, we got closed period for manure application, decree on use of fertilizer. The Nitrates Directive had, of course, a very large influence, which we tried to deal with the mineral accounting system. But in the end, the European Commission did not accept our mineral accounting system, so we had to come with other action plans to deal with the Nitrates Directive. And in fact, laws became stricter and stricter. And in 2007 also, low-emission housing became mandatory, because the manure policy was not only based on phosphate, but was also based on nitrate and on ammonia, and especially application techniques for manure, housing for animals was all based on ammonia. And then in 2014 it started with mandatory manure processing, because we still have a huge surplus. Part of the surplus is exported, but now it has become mandatory because the market was not functioning as it should. And then in 2015 the quota system ended, and this was considered as a liberation day by many dairy farmers. But okay, it would have its consequences. And in the whole set of manure policy, the national action plans for the Nitrates Directive were essential. And we were always going for derogation, because our livestock density was that high. Without derogation, we would have to reduce the animal numbers, and we would have to reduce the total milk production in the Netherlands. So we went for derogation. And I think it was in the second action plan that there was also phosphate policy included. This was essential for the derogation. And then there was a maximum excretion level defined at almost 173 million kilos of phosphate. There's no agronomic rationale behind it. It's just a level of 2002. And they said, that's the level, and you don't go beyond. And this was partitioned over the various sectors. And the dairy sector got 84.9 million kilos per year as maximum phosphate excretion. And it was not possible to buy excretion rights from the other sectors. Some farmers tried, but there is no option that you can buy phosphate excretion rights from the pig sector and use them in the dairy sector. So this is the amount for the dairy sector. And it is monitored via excretion standards, animal numbers from statistics, phosphate contents of all feed types, because a lot of roughage is analyzed in service laboratories, and so we have thousands of data from that. And the feed industry also knows exactly the phosphate content of the feed. And we know the standard rations from our farm accountancy data network. And well, here you see an example of the nitrogen and phosphorus excretion defaults that are used, because everything is based on defaults at the national level. And here you see, well, it's related here to the milk urea content of 22. For other urea contents, you have different excretion figures. There are all standards for it, and you have to use it on your farm. And here you see, well, depending on milk production, of course, and also the phosphate excretion per cow. This is per dairy cow without young stock. Here you see the figures of the phosphate excretion of the dairy herd in blue. So going from 85, 86, going down, and in 2010 there was a small peak due to higher phosphate concentrations, and again in 2014 and 15 when people were already preparing for the abolishment of the quota system, and they were already having more young stock. And then you see that in 2015 we exceeded the phosphate excretion by 8 million kilos. And already the exceedance in 2010 gave a reason to action, and not by the government but by the private sector itself, because they were clearly told you're not allowed to exceed this amount, and they also knew that they would put the derogation at risk when they would exceed the phosphate excretion. So there came the compound feed agreement, which was a private sector agreement, and their maximum phosphate contents in feed were defined in compound feed. And in case where you were feeding a lot of maize silage, you needed concentrates, compound feeds with high crude protein content, there was a maximum defined for the phosphate to crude protein ratio. Well, in 2015 the exceedance was much higher, 8 million kilos, and this was caused by increase in animal numbers but also fluctuations in the phosphate contents of feed, especially in the roughage, which was relatively high. And then the phosphate feed, the compound feed agreement appeared not to be enough to deal with that, of course, because the animal numbers were increasing sharply. And there where the government had said, okay, it's your responsibility, try to organize this, now we could see that the sector was not able to manage the growth and to stay within the phosphate limits. So at that moment, the government issued a phosphate quota plan, but the point is that if you give phosphate quota to farmers, it becomes an asset. As soon as you end your farm, you can sell it, and it was considered as support to the private sector, state support, which was not allowed. So this plan was declined end of 2016, which meant that there was more or less a crisis because everyone had expected that this phosphate plan would go on. So an alternative plan had to be developed end of 2016, early 2017, and that was really a crisis. But they developed a plan, mainly also with a very important role for Friesland-Campina, who is the most important dairy producer producer in our country, having about 80% of the market. So they had a very strong interest in organizing this, because otherwise when we would lose the derogation, we would have much lower milk production in the years to come. So there were 3 ways to reduce the amount of phosphate, about 8 million kilos of phosphate. The first is a stricter feed agreement. So the feed agreement with the private sector had to become stricter. Lower phosphate content in the feed, a lower phosphate to crude protein ratio. A buyout with 50 million euros, partly paid by the Netherlands and the European Commission, and partly by the private sector. And that would be good for 2.5 million kilos of phosphate, which is about 42,000 heads of dairy cows, including young stock. And a reduction in animal numbers. And then it means that the farms who are still in production, if the phosphate excretion on their farm is larger than their application standard, their allowance, they have to reduce the animal numbers that were there on the 2nd of July 2015, minus 4%. The farmers that have enough land to apply their animal manure, so where the phosphate excretion is lower than the application standards, they have to go back to the reference numbers of the 2nd of July 2015. And there will be a kind of bonus-malus system, so farmers will be fined if they have higher animal numbers. And this is scrutinized on a monthly basis by the Dutch government and by the European Commission, which in fact means that there is a very strong scrutiny. What does it mean on farm level? Well, on farm level for a long time already, if your nitrogen or your phosphate excretion with manure is higher than the application standards, you have to export manure from the farm. And a lot of farmers really have to export manure. And the largest exceedance defines the manure export. What we see that on grassland-based farms, it's often nitrogen. On farms with a lot of maize, we see that phosphorus is often the critical factor. And this nitrogen and phosphate excretion is based on standards. I showed you the standards before. You can use these, but some farmers said, yes, but we are more efficient, and it's not fair that we have to deal with the standards. So in the last years, they developed the Annual Nutrient Cycling Assessment, ANCA, as a tool that can calculate the farm-specific excretion of nitrogen and phosphorus. It means that you have to collect a lot of data about all the feed that is bought, all the milk that is sold, animals that are sold, etc. So a complete nutrient balance is made of the farm. And to do this, a centralized data collection has been set up, which means that all the data about buying feed, buying other materials, selling milk and animals, etc., is all collected in a central database. And many organizations are involved in this central database. It means that farmers hardly have to fill in data because it comes via all the organizations. It goes to the central database. It also means that it is enforced by all the sector organizations. And it is accepted by the Ministry of Economic Affairs as a tool so that you can have your farm-specific excretion, and which in many cases means that you need to export less manure compared to applying the default values. And currently we are extending this ANCA tool also to greenhouse gas emissions. So all the information is also used for calculating greenhouse gas emissions, and we only need little additional information. But we're also discussing to have all the data for the greenhouse gas emissions also in the centralized data tool. Here you see the application standards for phosphate in 2017, which are aiming at a phosphate surplus on field basis of nil. And then you see if you have a low phosphate status, well, I gave you the figures there, are phosphate extracted with ammonium lactate, which is used on grassland, and phosphate extracted with water for arable land. And then you see low status, 100 kilos on grassland, 75 kilos on arable land, medium 90 and 60, and if you have a high phosphate status, it's 80 and 50. This 80 and 50 is lower than the annual uptake by grass or crops, which means that your status will go down and will go back to the medium value. Colleagues of mine did experiments for 16 years, well, it's still ongoing for 18 years, but the last 2 years have not been reported in public. And there you see that the green bar is with a phosphate surplus of 0 kilos, the blue bar with a phosphorus surplus of 9 kilos, which means about 20 kilos of phosphate, and the red bar with 18 kilos of phosphorus, so about 40 kilos of phosphate. And then you see sand, conventional sand, organic, another sandy soil which is different, which is in the south, clay soils, and then peat soils. And then you see in general that there is a yield reduction in the situation where the phosphate surplus is nil. Although this is, you see that sometimes with a lower phosphate surplus of 9 kilos, there's little difference. In other situations, you see that also there is a difference. But on the clay soil, which is a young clay soil, you see that in fact the phosphate surplus does not have any impact. So there are some yield effects. Yield is reducing a little. In addition to that, in 2002 we started also with plots without any phosphate added. So there we are mining. And there we see very strong yield reductions, going up to 50, 60 or 70%. Especially on the sandy soils you see very strong reductions in grassland yields. What we also see in practice is that the phosphorus content of grass silages is going down. Although there is a large fluctuation, but you can see a trend line which goes from, well, let's say 4.2, 4.3 to, well, below 4.0. And of course there is a lot of debate about what is the minimum phosphate content of the feed to keep the animal healthy. Well, the red line is used now as we say, okay, this is the animal requirement, 3.7. Some of my colleagues say, well, you could go down to 3.5, although in some periods that's critical, you have to be a bit higher. But you see that we have to take care of our phosphate, especially also when you go lower with the phosphate in concentrates. One of the things that happens when phosphate is critical on your farm is that people are increasing their feed efficiency. So the more milk per kilo of feed, but also it means that you can have more milk per kilo of nitrogen excreted and more milk per kilogram of phosphate excreted. And here you see the milk production per kilogram of phosphate starting at about 120, going up to over 150 in 2012 and then going down again. And this reduction in the last years is caused by the fact that we have more young stock, because we were increasing young stock to have more dairy cows after the 1st of May of 2015. So that's not caused by poorer feeding, but by more young stock. So here you see that at this moment it's in the range of about 145 kilos of milk per kilo of phosphate excreted. But of course this is an average. And here you see it's also related to the milk production. This is the same table as I used before, but now you see on the right hand side the milk per kilogram of phosphate at herd level. So then I assumed also a certain number of young stock per dairy cow, and then you see, well, 8,000 liters 141, 9,000 liters 148. So that's the amount of milk per kilogram of phosphate excreted. So from that point of view you see that the higher milk production is interesting to be more efficient in milk. And that's what you see in the Netherlands at the moment, that there is really a tendency to increase milk productions more and more. Not only for phosphate, also for nitrogen, but also for greenhouse gas emissions. This is a group of front runners. This is a pilot group where we're also working with greenhouse gas emissions, and then you see that the average of this group, the farmers A to J, is 190 kilos of milk per kilogram of phosphate excreted. And then you see also the range that we find in the Farm Accountancy Data Network, ranging between 105 and 200. So there is a very wide range, and we think that there is still opportunity to improve. Well, steering phosphate in feeding. Well, in grass silage, it's hard to manage. We see that the weather conditions play a role, and that's also reflected in the large variation in the phosphate contents between the years in the previous graph. The phosphate content in silage is low, and now at this moment, the maximum phosphate content in compound feed is 4.3 grams per kilo, or if you're rich in protein, it means that there is a phosphate to crude protein ratio of 2.2, which means that if you take the crude protein content and then you have 2.2%, that's your maximum content of phosphate. And there is, so this is the exception for protein-rich compound feeds. And you see that some farmers try to use this exception to feed more protein, or to feed more phosphorus. Then, the question, is there room for dairy production in the Netherlands? Because we're struggling with phosphate already for a long time. We're close to the limit of 84.9 million kilos. We have to deal with the nitrates directive, and we already applied for derogation in all the action plans that we had, and in 2018 a new action plan has to be developed, and again we want the derogation. Because already with the quota system, when we were producing 11.5 megatons of milk, we needed the derogation. Now the dairy sector, industry and farmers have the ambition to go to over 13 megatons of milk. We dearly need the derogation. But also with ammonia we're struggling. And not only by the dairy sector, the other sectors of course as well, but what we see that there is a decrease in grazing in the Netherlands. In some regions not even half of the animals is grazing anymore, and when they are grazing, well, there is a new definition of grazing in the Netherlands. That's 720 hours of grazing, 120 days, 6 hours per day. If you graze more than 720 hours, you get a bonus by the dairy companies, which made that one of my younger colleagues, when we were comparing and we were discussing, okay, this is an analysis of complete grazing, and then he said, okay, so this is 720 hours? I said, no, this is one of my former experiments. This was 180 days, 20 hours per day. So that's 3,600 hours. That's what we considered as complete grazing 20 years ago. So you see, references are shifting. But it means that when we house our animals more, we have more ammonia. And we're struggling with ammonia as well, I will show you. And then greenhouse gas emissions, well, so far it's just a number of intentions, and there has been a good reduction since 1990, and in a similar rate as has been mentioned this morning here for Northern Ireland. But if you look at the new documents about the effort sharing, there is really quite a severe goal. Minus 36% in the Netherlands with little flexibility via land use change. Beside that, we have to deal with a number of societal issues. And already this morning when we spoke about precision agriculture and the digital agriculture, you saw that there will be a link between what happens on the farm and what happens on the consumer side. And we can't ignore it, and that's grazing cattle. People want to see cattle out. So that's really an issue in the Netherlands. And if you are producing milk as a dairy company like Friesland Campina or the others, and it's not from grazed cattle, you can't sell it anymore. Supermarkets only want milk from cattle that have grazed outside. So the other milk, well, okay, it goes into cheese and we export it because foreigners don't bother the grazing. So, but grazing is really an issue. Animal welfare, longevity, also an important issue. And well, related to that now, the things as that we separate the calf from the cow immediately, which is considered as being terrible. But also biodiversity. And biodiversity, well, especially in the Netherlands, every spring there is the debate about the meadowbird protection. Because intensifying dairy systems has led to a dramatic decrease in the numbers of meadowbirds. and I don't know the English names for it, so I will not mention them, but some of these birds have, well, the largest fraction of the population, about 80% of the global population, is brooding in the Netherlands. And their numbers are really decreasing. So there is a lot of attention paid to that. Well, here the ammonia, the national emission ceiling, which in 2010 was 128 million kilos, goes down to 122 million kilos. And the dairy sector, well, would be lower, somewhere, well, you see, compared to 2010, so we would have to reduce from 50 to 45. That was the plan by the dairy sector. But as you see, we're increasing. So also here we will face problems. So coming back to this question, in fact, the Dutch dairy sector is close to every constraint: phosphorus, nitrogen, ammonia, and greenhouse gas emissions. Still, the derogation is desperately needed. Future greenhouse gas emission reduction will really be a challenge, because the 36% means that we have to go to 800 grams of CO2 equivalents per liter of milk, which is quite severe. And there are conflicting interests, because the dairy sector is really losing its good name. I told you about grazing, about the meadowbird protection, but also about the landscape destruction. And it means that the good name is gone, or is not as good as it was anymore. And then we also have to face climate change adaptation, because the climate will also change. It will also affect the production conditions, and we have to consider that. Which means that, at least in research, and we're also discussing with sector organizations now, we should debate about the long-term future of dairy, where also volume, the V word, is part of the debate. So far, it has been out of the debate. You're not allowed to discuss the V word. But I think we have to, especially in a country like ours, where it's a very livestock-dense country. I thank you for your attention.